There are approximately 7,000 languages currently spoken in the world. Linguists estimate that between 2 and 3,000 additional languages have gone extinct in recorded history. Of those extinct languages, fewer than 300 have been documented well enough that a modern speaker could, theoretically, reconstruct them. Middle Cornish is one of them. It was spoken in what is now Cornwall, England, until approximately 1650, when its last native speakers died without passing it on. There are no audio recordings. There are no living teachers. There is no community. There are texts, limited, academic, accessible only to specialists. Elena had no background in linguistics. She had never been to Cornwall. She had never studied any extinct language, and she spoke Middle Cornish with an accent that the Edinburgh professor described as consistent with the dialect spoken in the Penwith Peninsula in the early 17th century. We are not telling you what this means. We are telling you what the records show. On the morning of April 3, 2019, Elena Vasquez was driving to work on a 2-lane road outside of Bristol, England. She was 34 years old. She worked as a graphic designer. She had lived in Bristol for 6 years, having moved from Madrid in her late 20s. She spoke English and Spanish fluently. She had studied French briefly in school. She had no particular interest in history, no connection to Cornwall, and no background in linguistics of any kind. At 8:47 in the morning, a vehicle ran a red light at an intersection and struck her car on the driver's side. The impact was significant. Elena was unconscious by the time the first responders arrived. She was transported to Bristol Royal Infirmary, where she was assessed, stabilized, and placed in the intensive care unit. Imaging revealed a traumatic brain injury, significant but, the physicians believed, survivable. She was placed in an induced coma to allow the swelling to reduce. She remained in that coma for 11 days. On April 14th, the medical team began the process of bringing her out. She regained consciousness on the morning of April 15th. Her husband, David, was in the room. The attending nurse was present. And within minutes of Elena opening her eyes and becoming oriented enough to attempt a speech, it became clear that something was wrong. Or, depending on how you look at it, something was different. The sounds that Elena produced were not random. This was established quickly, within the first hours. She was not confused, not making the disorganized vocalizations sometimes seen in patients recovering from brain injury. She was speaking, deliberately, consistently, with the cadence and structure of intentional language. The problem was that no one in the room, and no one called in over the following 48 hours, could identify what language it was. The hospital brought in an interpreter service. The service covered 47 languages. None matched. A neurolinguist was consulted. She described the phonology as archaic, possibly Germanic or Celtic in origin, but could not identify it more precisely. A colleague at the University of Bristol's linguistics department was contacted. He listened to a recording. He suggested it might be a dialect, possibly Welsh adjacent, possibly Breton. He was not certain. On the 6th day, someone thought to contact Professor Alistair Drummond. Drummond was 71 years old. He had retired from the University of Edinburgh 3 years earlier after a 40-year career, specializing in the Celtic languages of southwestern England and northwestern France, a field so narrow that he was, by most accounts, one of perhaps a dozen people in the world who had spent serious time in it. He was sent a recording. He asked for it to be played again. Then he sat down, and he said, "This is Middle Cornish. Specifically, it appears to be a dialect associated with the Penwith Peninsula, the westernmost tip of Cornwall. The phonological features I'm hearing are consistent with speech from the early to mid-17th century, approximately 1600 to 1650. He paused. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I have spent 40 years studying this language. I have read everything written in it. I have spent decades reconstructing its sounds from textual evidence. Another pause. I have never heard it spoken by a living person, because there are no living people who speak it. And what I'm hearing on this recording is not a reconstruction. It is not an approximation. It is fluent, native quality speech. Drummond traveled to Bristol within the week. He spent over the following 3 months a total of 60 hours in conversation with Elena, or rather, in conversation as Elena would allow. She was cooperative, but inconsistent. Some days she spoke at length. Other days she said very little. And as the weeks passed, there were signs that her facility with the language was changing, not deteriorating exactly, but shifting, as though the connection to it was not stable. What she said, in the portions that Drummond was able to translate and document, was, by his account, coherent and detailed. She described a place, a village, stone buildings, a central well, a church with a particular feature, a carved figure above the entrance that she described in some detail, a coastline visible from the high ground, specific landmarks. She described people. A woman she referred to consistently with a name that Drummond transliterated as Mariasek, a man she called Joan, children, a household, seasons, weather, the sound of the sea. She described daily life, work, meals, the rhythms of a small community. She described illness. She described loss. She described a winter that was harder than the others. Drummond's assessment, after 3 months. What Elena described was consistent, internally coherent, and geographically plausible for the Penwith area in the early 17th century. It was not consistent with anything she could have read. The level of domestic and social detail she provided goes far beyond anything in the surviving textual record. He wrote in his notes, "She is describing a life, not a historical account." A life. 3 months after Elena woke from her coma, an archaeological survey began in the Penwith Peninsula. The survey was not related to Elena's case. It had been planned for years. A routine examination of a coastal area that historical records suggested had been more densely settled in the early modern period than previously thought. What the survey found in October of 2019 was the remains of a small settlement. Stone foundations. The outline of a central open space, consistent with a village square, the remains of what appeared to be a well, and at the edge of the settlement the foundation of a larger building, a church, based on its orientation and dimensions, with a carved stone fragment near the entrance. The fragment depicted a human figure. Drummond was informed of the find. He drove to Cornwall. He compared the fragment with Elena's description of the carved figure above the church entrance. He did not make a public statement about what he found. But in a private letter to a colleague, which the colleague shared with us after Drummond's death in 2022, he wrote, "The correspondence is not approximate. It is precise. She described something that was buried under 3 feet of soil when she described it. I don't have a framework for this. I've spent 40 years building frameworks. I don't have one for this." On April 23, 2019, the 9th day of Elena's recovery, 2 men arrived at Bristol Royal Infirmary. They identified themselves to hospital administration as representatives of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the Vatican's scientific body. They presented credentials. They requested access to the patient. The hospital, after some deliberation, granted access. The 2 men spent 3 hours with Elena. David, her husband, was not permitted in the room during the meeting. He waited in the corridor. He told us that through the closed door he could hear, at various points, what sounded like a sustained conversation. Not examination, not questioning, but actual back-and-forth dialogue. When the men emerged, they thanked the hospital staff and left. They were carrying a folder that David said had not been with them when they arrived. We contacted the Pontifical Academy of Sciences for comment. We were told they had no record of sending representatives to Bristol in April of 2019. We provided the names from the visitor log. We were told those names did not correspond to any current or former employees of the academy. We asked whether they could explain who the men were. We did not receive a response. Elena spoke Middle Cornish for exactly 40 days after waking from her coma. On the 41st day, June 4, 2019, she woke up speaking English. She did not remember the previous 40 days clearly. She described the period as dreamlike. She had impressions, fragments, but no coherent continuous memory. She did not remember the conversations with Drummond. She did not remember the men from the Vatican. She did not remember describing the village, the people, the carved figure above the church entrance. When Drummond played her a recording of herself speaking Middle Cornish, she listened with what he described as polite attention. She did not recognize the language. She said, "Is that me?" He said yes. She listened to more of the recording, then she said, "I don't understand any of it." Drummond asked her, gently, carefully, if she had any sense of what it was about, if any of the sounds connected to anything. Elena listened for a long time. Then she said, "I feel sad when I hear it. I don't know why. I just feel very sad." Professor Drummond spent the remaining 3 years of his life working on what he called the Elena material. He produced a complete transcription and translation of everything recorded during the 40 days. The transcription runs to approximately 400 pages. The translation is, by his own account, incomplete. There are words and phrases for which he found no parallel in the existing textual record. Words that appeared to be genuine vocabulary of the period but had not survived in any written source. He submitted the work to 2 academic journals. Both declined to publish. One cited the impossibility of independent verification. The other cited concerns about the implications of the material, a reason Drummond noted acidly in correspondence that had nothing to do with scholarship. He died in March of 2022. His papers went to the University of Edinburgh. The Elena transcription is in the archive. It is accessible to researchers. As far as we have been able to determine, no researcher has requested it. Here is what we can confirm. A woman with no background in linguistics woke from a coma speaking a dialect of Middle Cornish last used as a living language approximately 400 years ago. A specialist in that language described her speech as fluent and native quality. She described a village with specific details that corresponded months later to an archaeological site discovered in the area she described. The lead physician on her case refused to sign the official medical report. 2 men, identifying themselves as Vatican representatives, spent 3 hours with her, and their existence was subsequently denied by the institution they claimed to represent. After exactly 40 days, she stopped speaking the language and retained no memory of the period. Here is what we don't know: where the language came from, what the men from the Vatican heard and took, what Drummond's untranslatable words mean, why she felt sad when she heard herself, and what, if anything, is in those 400 pages that nobody has asked to read. We want to be careful, as always, about what we claim. We are not saying Elena lived a previous life. We are not saying the soul is real and travels between bodies. We are not saying the Vatican is suppressing evidence of reincarnation. We are saying a woman woke up speaking a dead language. A specialist confirmed it. An archaeologist found what she described. A physician refused to sign the official explanation. The Vatican came and then denied it had come. And 40 days later, it was over, as suddenly and completely as it had begun. We don't know what happened to Elena during those 11 days in a coma. We don't know where Middle Cornish came from. But we know this: Professor Drummond spent 40 years learning that language from texts. And when he heard Elena speak it, he said it didn't sound like someone who had learned it from texts. It sounded like someone who had lived it. If you know something we don't, you know where to find us. subscribe, share this, and leave a comment. What do you think happened to Elena during those 11 days?